Picture this. You're sitting by your close friends at a table. There's fantasy music playing. You're in a new world where there are unexplainably terrible events. And you and your friends are determined to stop them from happening, so you form an adventuring party. All of your personality and items are written on the paper in front of you. On your journey, you find out that there's a monster behind these terrors and decide that you're going to fight it and bring peace back to the land. All you need to do to win this encounter is to roll a 20-sided die. Success! You and your friends cheer and high-five after killing the bad guy. This is one of the many activities that Dungeons & Dragons players take part of when playing the game. Hey everyone, my name is Claude Neve, and today I will be talking about the impact of modern technology on the Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game. Popular culture has many niche genres, and many of those are becoming even more popularized. The longer technology is around, the more accessible a game becomes. For example, Dungeons & Dragons, a tabletop role-playing game, or TTRPG, has become more and more mainstream and well-known due to the developments of mainstream media. I believe that D&D podcasts, high production value playthroughs, and alternate versions of the original game are becoming so widely accepted and popularized on many platforms, such as Spotify and YouTube, are because of how new media makes hobbies that may have been looked down upon in the past become more widespread in popular culture and more accepted in the public eye. Dungeons & Dragons was made back in 1973 by a local Wisconsinite named Gary Gygax, expanding off of another TTRPG that he made called Chainmail. Gygax officially made D&D with his friend Dave Arneson. In the first volume of Dungeons & Dragons, the creators mention that D&D is a tabletop game made by wargamers for wargamers, and that the 1,000 sets of the 3 little brown booklets and boxes sold to more than just the average wargamer, making tabletop gaming start to rise in popularity. They go to mention that D&D is perceived to be difficult, or that it was incomplete without previous purchases of Chainmail and experience of playing other games of similar style. Even with all the hiccups, within the first official volume of D&D, the information and the references to the outside games are removed to create a more streamlined gaming experience. This was the first time Dungeons & Dragons was changed for the community to make it more digestible and better for the players, and is most definitely not the last time for this to happen. As of 2014, there have been 8 different versions of the game, all based off of the one released in 1974. Going from the original 3 brown booklets to Classic, 1st Edition, 2nd, 3rd, 3.5, 4th, and now the most commonly played on the internet, 5th Edition, which is sold through Wizards of the Coast, along with other magical games such as Magic the Gathering and Duel Masters. Even with these hard-released versions, there are still many players who will tell you that there are as many versions as there are groups playing. Here with me to discuss D&D is my older brother, who was one of the main influences for me to play D&D and to continue playing D&D during the pandemic. Isaac, how would you say Dungeons & Dragons was perceived when you first started playing versus now?
Let's see, I started playing Dungeons & Dragons, probably about 15 years ago now that I think about it. Longer than that, because I was in elementary school when my dad and his friend from growing up introduced me into Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons was, the fantasy of it wasn't any different than anything else children do in the backyard or playground, so fantasy and spell casting is pretty blasé to children running around as dinosaurs in their free time. So for me, there wasn't really any oh, this is weird and bad stereotypes associated with it because I hadn't been exposed to it. And now in my adult life, going about and work, it's extremely popular, of course. You see it everywhere on social media platforms like YouTube. You can't swing anyone who does a podcast-like format around without them suddenly creating their own channel or separate show for their Dungeons & Dragons.
Dungeons & Dragons is typically played with a group of participants who play through a campaign composed of battles, puzzles, exploration, and role-playing with no 2 campaigns that are ever the same. The concept being that you make a playable character in a fantasy world that is described and told through the Dungeon Master, DM, and determined from several rulebooks and manuals with dice rolling to determine statistics and the success rate of actions. There have been D&D movies, shows, video games, live-action playthroughs, and podcasts. D&D has transformed from just a storytelling game between players to recording and sharing.
I don't think technology has hurt Dungeons and Dragons or any role-play game for that matter at all. In fact, I consider it a massive boon. The big reasons being, one, just this right now with COVID, being able to meet up with friends who could be across the state, across the country, or in some cases, I've watched players in games where members are scattered around the globe from South Africa to Japan to Germany and all the way to the West Coast.
Technological production has brought Dungeons and Dragons to the masses more than the word of mouth ever could. But perhaps it has also diluted the game for the purists, the 50-year-old nerds who grew up playing it in their basement. Arguably, the accessibility has made old players have better convenience for dice, figurines, paints, rearrangeable maps, and other prop merchandise, as well as a larger playing pool. However, with the amount of reproduction, many variations have been made that stray away from the true version of D&D, such as Pathfinder, a mimic of the TTRPG, and as Walter Benjamin states in The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element: its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. Parts of this are very true for Dungeons and Dragons, where even if people play the same campaign, there is no way for each roll of the dice to ever be the same. There's also the issue with time and space being quite literal to the environment. No one is in their basement anymore during COVID with a group of friends. You're online. You're changing your form of communication.
COVID is a hiccup for, I think, the tabletop roleplay genre. If this had happened even 5 years ago, it would have killed, I think, the gaming industry for the most part. Most people would go to their video games. But with as accessible as streaming services, things like Discord and Twitch and the like, it's super easy still to get together, see and hear your friends, and play a game. With a role play game, the big thing is just being able to hear one another. Services exist like Fantasy Grounds and Roll20 where there are online formats for people to still see maps, share pictures, and even move their little figurines around. So COVID, while it is a pain for everyone, there are plenty of workarounds. I have myself 2 different games that I'm a part of that we still played during COVID. Not to get physically together, but online.
Benjamin uses the words perfect reproduction, which can be applied to how a dungeon master tries to communicate the story and fantasy world to players. One major complication in D&D through the many forms of communication the player and the DM have is since it's based completely off imagination, it is impossible to have 100% transfer of thoughts. What the DM describes does not always translate to the player effectively. What are some ways as a DM that you do your best to communicate what you are thinking to your players and make them get a good sense of their character's situation?
This is a skill that I've been trying to focus more and more as I have aged and matured as a dungeon master. The trick, it would seem, is that you want to try and incorporate all the senses. Unlike other means of storytelling, like a movie where all these lighting and sounds can be incorporated into one shot, or a book where the author can, depending on their pacing, include as much description as they would like, you have to keep the attention of potentially 4 or more players on exactly what you're trying to describe. And sometimes you're caught off guard and they want to know what's in a man's pocket. Well, that usually you have to come up on the fly. So coming up with interesting descriptions helps keep things memorable. You don't want just, all right, you walk into a room, you walk into a musty room with dust floating through the ambient light. It's a skill that is learned. Some people have a talent for it, and it's a great reason that you get people who love improv or voice acting, that they're so beloved by those who watch other people play.
Now, as a player on the other side of the DM screen, how would you communicate something back?
I try to do my best to do the same thing. If I'm playing a, mercenary swordsman, I'm not gonna just I walk into the room. No, I'm going to sashay into that room with my rapier rattling against my buckler on my hip as I look around the room, tilting my hat back, cocking the feather, etc. The trick is to keep things moving, usually, both as the dungeon master and as the players, to avoid certain lulls in the conversation. If no one is talking, then nothing's happening and people tend to get distracted. If I, as a player, talk too long, though, I am taking away the spotlight from other players or from the dungeon master or game master from progressing the story. It's hard for the innkeep to tell me where the monster is or that he's got a basement full of rats if I keep, you know, describing how I dance on every table.
A perfect reproduction is already hard to make of a Dungeons & Dragons campaign for the experiences you get as a player. But how about the physical game itself? Everyone can go out and buy a board game and get a different amount of sentimental value from the interactions that they get while playing the game. Some players have made their own fan versions or inspired tabletop role-playing games that stray farther than the version that Gygax and Arneson have originally made. On August 20th, 2020, Jacob Andrews, a D&D player, released his own free version on Twitter, where all you need to do to play is a piece of paper, a writing utensil, and one 6-sided die for a group of 4 players. Andrews named this game You Awaken in a Strange Place, and its intended design is for players to be completely unprepared and base it all off of improv. Most other elaborate campaigns have lots of preparation for the dungeon master and for the players to ensure the most engagement possible and the deepest commitment to the world while playing the game. For You Awaken in a Strange Place, there's limited information on character building and how combat is supposed to play out, which was the angles that Andrews was going for. The form of gameplay is even farther from what Benjamin describes for perfect reproduction compared to how mass-produced items are, such as dice, can be made. As a TTRPG player, you could love this or hate this. The best way to find out is for you to try it yourself. If you like more rigid rules and not a on-the-spot scenario where there are a lack of information for a manual, then I would not recommend this version for you. Although, if you enjoy not having to prepare anything before a game night and want to make it an instant wacky adventure or spiral into the most absurd chain of events, then I can confirm that this is something you should try. This is meant to be a one-session game and is completely directed by the players and the GM in a group effort to have fun. Everything from your character's name and personality to the conflict of the imaginary world you're in is decided at the start of this game, which ends when everyone feels as if the adventure is complete. I personally have played D&D 3.5, 5e, a few homebrew mashups of Pathfinder, and whatever the dungeon master decides that we're playing that evening for a campaign. And I've also played through a session of You Awaken in a Strange Place. I love all of them, and how each have a slightly different structure of rules for how to go about combat and the effect of your dice rolls. If you want less prep and more moments where you have to think on your feet, You Awaken in a Strange Place is the choice for you. What are your thoughts on mimics to D&D? No, not the actual little creature in the D&D game, but are mimic versions such as Pathfinder, You Awaken in a Strange Place, and other role-playing tabletop games, should people stay pure to D&D?
If you look into its history, you'll find out that the creators of Pathfinder actually created or were part of the teams that made the first couple editions of Dungeons and Dragons for Wizards of the Coast, the company that currently owns the property. But having them out there, I don't see as a bad thing at all. It lets you choose the kind of story and setting or framework of mechanics that you like to use and continue to play. There's nothing that stops me from pulling the AD&D books, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons books, off my shelf and trying to run a game of that other than finding players willing to join me in a story.
Isaac and I have both spoken about how communication is very important when it comes to D&D, since the game is based solely off of imagination and a couple of books. Yes, there are props that have been added, such as the rearrangeable maps, reusable character sheet notebooks, and even miniature figurines of your specific character so you can visualize yourself in the world that you're playing in. In Marshall McLuhan's The Medium is the Message and James Carey's Communication is Culture, they argue that there is more meaning to the way people choose to communicate than people give credit. Instead of seeing the advancement of podcasts, video tutorials, and player member sites as a destructive additive to the games, we can view these technological advancements as a way to draw in more players, educate them on the nuances of the game, share victories and defeats, and commune with like-minded people, all of which that builds the community as well as a market for all things D&D. Likewise, without the development of tech and increase of players, the game itself would not have gone through the different editions of the game. Players now have more options to choose a version and accommodating playstyle to suit them better and make it easier for them to learn the game. In addition, D&D has no strict rule against bending the rules. Many people homebrew or create their own methods of playing, creation of races, and anything they desire to apply to the game. Through media development, many new platforms have risen since the making of Dungeons & Dragons to help them homebrew their own way to present the game that they want to play. The biggest being the internet, which is the catalyst for the mass production of modern-day D&D content. Each version, however, has flaws due to the way it is communicated. With podcasts, you lose body language that you would get from the players and the Dungeon Master. You're missing out on them hunching over when you need a new non-playable character, or NPC. A filmed and edited game removes lifelike experiences only possible if you were to be sitting at a table with other players. You lose your sense of touch. It is not the same effect of getting a secret text message when you find a hidden scroll versus the DM handing you a rolled up sheet of paper for you to unravel and read to your party members. Both audio and video and the original game came without anything other than the rulebooks themselves, which can cost you anywhere between $30 to $100 or even more. You have to piece together these materials if you want to play effectively.
Dungeons & Dragons and the like are tabletop roleplay games, meaning they're meant to be around a table where you have your paper, pencil, and perhaps some miniatures with your dice. Dungeons & Dragons over the years has become more and more to a small extent, an add-on game. You're going to buy miniatures because they look pretty. You're going to paint them up because you want them to look better. You get the maps to help show things. They aren't bad in any way. Visual aspects simply are additional aids. Again, when I first started playing D&D, we didn't have maps so much. We ended up actually using some Lego pieces that we had, primarily because it helped with combat, knowing who's where and how far away something is. Nowadays, those have become staples, and therefore it seems a little more challenging to not use visual aids and just simply describe things audibly.
Despite these limits, each version comes with benefits as well. Most podcasts and filmed versions add their own original music scores, like NADPod, or Not Another D&D Podcast, as well as Dark Dice, a D&D audio drama horror campaign that hired an orchestra to play an original score. With the assistance of modern technology, you can listen and watch people play the game around the clock. On top of that, the filmed playthroughs tend to add more production value of props and player character pieces, spending and investing lots and lots of money to keep viewers interested with the quality of their shows to make the world come to life.
But when you look out at the various podcasts and YouTube channels and streams that do Dungeons & Dragons, even Wizards of the Coast themselves have embraced this. The higher end production ones tend to be the most memorable because you get to see the fun artwork, the beautiful scenery or models that are painted up for it, while at the lower end you have a group of people just talking. But there's nothing wrong with just talking. Again, it is a story. You get to let your imagination flow. If you ever looked up fan art for a particular book, it's the same thing. The medium is just spoken rather than written.
When playing with friends at a table in the originally intended form of D&D, you get a great bond that is formed and inside jokes to keep with your friends. There's no limit to the amount of content of D&D that could be consumed or made. Dungeons & Dragons went from a nerd-only game to something that made comedians and content creators successful through the use of mass production and consumption, as well as the technological medium they chose to present themselves to large audiences with. Not just filmed or an audio-only version, but as it was intended to, a tabletop role-playing game shared amongst friends. Thank you to Isaac Neve, who sat with me to discuss his thoughts on such a fun topic. He was there with me during our first game at our dining room table and now online. I look forward to many more adventures with him.
Absolutely, anytime. And remember, play more games.
So if you don't mind, I have a game to get back to. The background music was by Feslian Studios. Other sound effects were by Claude Neve.